Hey, hi, hello. Welcome to Diana Emerson. Today we are going to listen to the new detectives, Drowning and the Scent of Death.
In Alabama, a few strips of evidence are all investigators have to link her to her killer. In Texas, the body of a woman swept away in a flash flood is found downstream. Can forensic scientists wash away deception and find proof of murder? A car crash on a country road in Wisconsin claims a woman's life. Detectives must wade through ambiguous evidence to prove her death was no accident. Once, water could dissolve evidence linking murderers to their crimes. But today, scientists can look beneath the surface for proof of homicide, even when the victims are found dead in the water. Grand Bay, Alabama, May 21st, 1994. Two teenagers floating on a pond, known locally as Blue Hole, noticed something floating in the water. As they approached, they realized it was a human body. They fled the scene and alerted their parents, who called the police. When the Mobile County Sheriff's deputies arrived at the scene, they recovered the body of an elderly woman. It was clear that this was not an accidental drowning. The victim had a tire jack chained around her waist, and her hands had been removed. As investigators began documenting the scene, detectives contacted the Sheriff's Department for a missing persons check. They hoped to search at NCIC, a database containing descriptions of people reported missing, would help them identify the victims. Sergeant Harold Bolster explains.
All missing person reports or missing persons are placed on the NCIC, and we look for any local matches, anything close to Mobile or Moss Point, Pascagoula, anything in the general region that might match up to what we had.
Only one name fit the description of the victim. 85-year-old Irma Williams had been reported missing the day before in nearby Moss Point, Mississippi. Dispatchers contacted Detective John J. Gaffney, who was investigating that disappearance.
And they advised that the Mobile County Sheriff's Office discovered a body in Grand Bay, Alabama, which is the next jurisdiction over from us, and that they believed the body was could possibly be my missing person.
Detectives from the Moss Point, Mississippi Police Department were dispatched to the scene. After getting a detailed description of the victim from deputies, the detectives believed they had found Irma Williams. It appeared that their missing persons case was now a homicide. Investigators began searching the surrounding area for any evidence that would help them identify the killer. But a large amount of trash and debris had collected to the pond. Determining what was evidence and what wasn't would be difficult. As investigators scoured the area near the water's edge, they found fresh tire tracks imprinted in the sand. Unsure if these tracks had been left by the killer, plaster casts were made. As the search of the area continued, detectives noticed a cigarette butt with a flattened end hidden among some overgrowth. Unlike most of the trash in the area, it didn't appear to have been there very long. It was collected and sent to the lab for further analysis. Though investigators believed that the victim was Irma Williams, they needed a positive identification. Sure. They contacted her relatives. James and Sharon Williams confirmed that the victim was James's grandmother, Irma Williams.
I know this is hard. I'm gonna have to ask you a couple questions.
James told the officer he and his wife were very close to Irma. He described her as a vivacious woman who loved life and her family. Though her husband of more than 50 years had recently passed away, his estate had allowed her to remain independent. But James said that his father, Henderson Williams, was not close with Irma. In fact, Sharon added that Henderson hadn't seemed very worried when she told him no one could locate his mother. Sharon said she'd gone to Henderson's house around 11 p.m. the night before and found him burning trash in the yard. When told his mother was missing, Henderson seemed distracted and unconcerned. He was preoccupied by the fire the entire time. Despite Henderson's lack of concern, Sharon and James could not imagine that he was involved in his own mother's murder. The autopsy on Irma Williams was performed by Dr. J.C. Upshaw Downs, the chief medical examiner for the state of Alabama. The official cause of death was listed as severe blunt force trauma to the head. Irma Williams had died well before being placed in the pond. And for Dr. Downs, the manner in which the victim's hands were removed was also telling.
Wow.
This was a clean cut, obviously a sharp instrument like a knife or a razor had been used. There was no hemorrhage or bleeding into the soft tissues. That told me that these were post-mortem injuries. And from that information, it became apparent that somebody was trying to obscure her identity.
By going to such great lengths to hide the victim's identity, investigators were confident that Hillary was someone close to her. They went to Irma's residence to search for answers. On a section of vinyl flooring in Irma's kitchen, investigators found reddish-brown stains that appeared to be blood. A plastic bag recovered from underneath the sink also looked blood-stained. Convinced they had found the murder scene, investigators continued searching for evidence of homicide. On the table, they noticed an ashtray full of cigarette butts. The ends of the filters were flattened, just like the one recovered from the crime scene.
I observed an ashtray that had a lot of cigarette butts in it with a real distinctive bite mark on them. I questioned the family about these cigarette butts, and they advised that it was their father's cigarette butts, that he had a real distinctive way he did on the filter.
Now, detectives wanted to speak to Irma's son, Henderson Williams. When they arrived at his home, he wasn't there. As they prepared to leave, investigators noticed a woman leaving the trailer on Henderson's property. She identified herself as Brenda Rowell. She rented the trailers from Henderson Williams. Though she stated that she and Henderson were close, she was unaware that Irma had been murdered. Investigators sensed that the news made Brenda uneasy. They asked her to accompany them to the Mobile County Sheriff's Department to answer more questions. Investigators asked Brenda if she'd seen anything unusual at Henderson's place recently. She mentioned seeing Henderson washing his car the day before. He'd scrubbed it inside and out, even the trunk. Brenda thought it was odd that Henderson would suddenly take such pride in the old car's appearance. The investigators showed her a picture of the tire jack recovered from Irma's body. Brenda was surprised. It looked like hers. She said she had lent it to Henderson recently, but he had not returned it. Investigators turned their focus toward Henderson's relationship with his mother.
She's a very sweet lady.
Brenda said that Henderson and Irma had been arguing over money from his father's estate. Irma felt her son was greedy and lazy and decided to cut him out of her will and denied him access to money left to her by his father. Henderson became irate. In fact, Brenda admitted that a few weeks back, she and Henderson had a bitter argument.
No, I don't like it. I don't want to.
Henderson wanted her to sign Irma's name on checks he had taken from his mother. Brenda was reluctant to do it. Henderson threatened to evict her from the trailer if she didn't. She felt she had no choice. She forged Irma's name on the checks. For detectives, a motive for murder was beginning to take shape. And Henderson Williams was now the prime suspect in the death of his mother. Now, investigators needed to prove it. To corroborate Brenda Rowell's story, detectives contacted the manager of Irma's bank. Not only did she confirm Brenda's account, she said that just before Irma's death, Irma had filed forgery charges against her son. Though the information didn't prove murder, it was enough for investigators to obtain a search warrant for Henderson's property. Police waited until Henderson was away from his residence before executing the warrant. An inspection of Henderson's vehicle revealed the presence of small reddish stains on a rear tail light and larger stains on the trunk's carpet. All of the samples were collected and sent to the state crime lab for further analysis. Investigators also took each impressions of the car's tires to compare to those recovered at the pond. As the search of Henderson's property continued, investigators located the burn pile described earlier by Sharon Williams. Sifting through the rubble, they found several small bone fragments. Mindful that the victim's hands had been removed and never found, investigators collected the remains. All of the evidence was pointing to Henderson Williams as the killer. But until investigators could physically link him to the murder, he would remain a free man. Police in Alabama and Mississippi struggled to solve the murder of 85-year-old Irma Williams, found floating in a local fishing pond. Though the circumstantial evidence pointed to her son, Henderson Williams, as the killer, investigators had no physical evidence tying him to the murder. Items collected from a search of Henderson's property were sent to the Alabama Department of Forensic Science. Medical examiner Dr. J.C. Upshaw Downs started with bone fragments found in the burn pile.
We were concerned at the time, since her hands had been removed, that those potentially could have been bones from Ms. Williams' hands. So they were examined by our anthropologist and also examined for DNA in order to determine if they were human, and if they were human, were they Ms. Williams. It turned out that they were non-human remains.
Still, examiners had other items recovered from Henderson's property. Serologist Elaine Scott analyzed stains taken from the trunk liner of Henderson's vehicle to determine if they were of human origin. Tetramethylbenzidine, a chemical that reacts to protein in human blood by turning it blue, is applied to the swabs. The initial screener confirmed the stains found in Henderson's trunk were human blood. Scott then repeated the process on the stains found on items from the victim's kitchen. Now, examiners needed to determine the source of the blood. DNA testing was performed on all the samples. After extracting and isolating specific genetic characteristics in each sample, examiners determined the blood found in the victim's kitchen was genetically consistent with the blood found in Henderson's car. When those results were compared to DNA samples taken from Irma Williams' autopsy, the results were indisputable.
The blood stains in this case were at the house and placed the victim bleeding in the house, and also they placed the victim bleeding on the car.
Though the evidence was powerful, it was not ironclad. To make their case, investigators needed to physically link Henderson Williams to the crime scene. And there was one piece of evidence that had to be tested. The cigarette butt found at the pond. With only microscopic traces of saliva to work with, examiners determined there was sufficient DNA in the cigarette butt to perform the analysis. Elaine Scott then compared those results to DNA taken from other cigarette butts known to be Henderson's.
The saliva did give us a DNA profile that matched to Mr. Williams, indicating that he had smoked the cigarette at the crime scene.
The information was enough to arrest Henderson Williams for the murder of his 85-year-old mother. In custody, Henderson maintained his innocence, claiming he hadn't been near the pond in recent days. But all of the forensic evidence suggested otherwise. Investigators had matched the tire tread impression recovered at the scene to a tire on Henderson's car. Police believe that Henderson Williams' anger raged out of control when his mother cut him off from his father's estate. Investigators believe that Henderson Williams went to his mother's home, where he beat her to death. He then removed her hands, hoping to prevent identification, then placed her body in the pond. In April 1996, Henderson Williams stood trial for the murder of his mother, Irma Williams. He was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. In Alabama, there was no doubt that a woman pulled from a small pond had been murdered. But in Texas, police would have to wade through the evidence to determine whether a woman's death was an accident or murder. In this story, some of the names have been changed. Fort Worth, Texas, May 3rd, 1987. Francis and Jesus de la Rosa were settling in for the evening when they heard screams outside their suburban home. A man, soaking wet and distraught, stumbled inside. He pleaded for them to call 911.
How to use the brother
He said his car had been swept away in a flash flood, and his girlfriend was missing. The Fort Worth Fire Department's Swift Water Rescue Team received the call.
knitting machine.
But then, these emergencies were Torrential rains had pounded the Fort Worth area during the previous month, destroying property and worse. According to Fire Captain Richard Ward, many people had lost their lives attempting to drive through flash floods.
The people were on their way to wherever, and they decide to try to cross the water or cross the road where the water's going, and they get swept downstream because just looking at it, they can't tell how deep the water is, and they always underestimate how powerful the water is.
This night, 2 people had made that mistake, and now one of them was missing. The rescue team searched the area near the bridge crossing where the car had been swept away. Divers scoured below the creek surface for any signs of the missing woman or the vehicle. But after several hours of exhaustive searching, rescuers found nothing. As the search continued, police questioned the driver, 40-year-old Domingo Turo, a Cuban immigrant who spoke broken English. Turo told police he had tried to drive through the water on the road. Detective Mike Garvin reviewed Turo's statement.
They didn't realize how swift the water was. He tried to back up, and it was too late. It started washing him off into the creek, and that he tried to get out and was in fact able to be in the victor boat to get out of the car.
Turo told police that he grabbed his girlfriend, 20-year-old Janice Walters, as the car filled with water and went tumbling downstream in the current. But the raging water broke his grasp, and she was lost. As the floodwaters began to recede several hours later, searchers were finally able to locate Turo's car. It was carried more than a mile from the crossing before being washed up on an embankment. Police retrieved the vehicle, but there was no sign of Janice Walters.
We performed a search around the vehicle, thinking that she might have stayed close to the vehicle whenever it was swept off the roadway. Our search around the vehicle and in the vehicle didn't find anything.
Rescuers continued looking for her, but with each passing hour, hopes of finding her unharmed grew dimmer. The search continued into the following day.
Call Northside
Around
Radiology.
midnight, searchers discovered a body washed up on the shoreline.
404-851-6577
Janice's description.
or 770-667-4089. Authorization code is VA003071015. This is for sedation for the open MRI.
20-year-old Janice Walters, killed when the car she and her boyfriend, Domingo Turo,
Hey,
were driving,
stop.
got swept away.
Go back. Okay. So,
authorities contacted Turo and Janice's sister, Kelly Hill, and asked them to identify the body. Kelly confirmed that her sister had been found. Investigators noticed that she seemed distant and cold toward Domingo Turo. In a statement taken later that day, Kelly confirmed that no one in her family was happy about Janice's relationship with Turo. Janice's body was transported to the Tarrant County morgue to undergo an autopsy.
VA
Chief Medical
messages.
Examiner Dr. Nizam Irwani was immediately struck by the condition of the body.
One of the strange things that we discovered at the autopsy was that the body was totally nude, and the story given to us was that she was wearing a blouse and a pair of blue jeans. In 20 years' time, I've never seen a case where the body's been totally disrobed.
And a necklace still clasped around the victim's neck had inexplicably remained intact, though there were numerous other injuries in the same area. Dr. Pirwani also noted the lack of telltale signs usually associated with drowning
Sedative
victims.
for the open MRI.
In most cases of drowning, one sees purging of frothy fluid, which is usually blood-tinged, and this comes out from the nostrils and the mouth, and it's also present in the trachea and the bronchioles. And this frothy fluid is due to admixing of air and water which is being inhaled in a person who is drowning. We didn't see such frothy fluid anywhere.
That meant there was no water in the victim's lungs. Janice Walters had not died of drowning. As Dr. Pirwani struggled to make sense of his findings, he examined injuries found on the victim's neck. He noticed what appeared to be curvilinear abrasions, injuries typically caused by a victim's fingernails in a struggle to break a stranglehold. None of Janice's injuries were consistent with a drowning death. Dr. Pirwani stopped the examination and contacted Fort Worth police. He wanted to be certain that he had not misunderstood the circumstances surrounding Janice's death. But investigators had no reason to believe that her death was anything but a tragic accident. And the tragedy didn't end with Janice's death alone. As Dr. Pirwani proceeded with the internal examination, he discovered that she was in the early stages of pregnancy. The examination held one last surprise. There were deep hemorrhages of the muscles in the victim's neck. For Dr. Pirwani, there was only one way to explain all of the injuries.
We were not able to show any water in the lung, no frothy fluid, no blood-tinged fluid in the trachea or the bronchial tree. So the negative findings of lungs as well as the positive findings of the neck were consistent with the manual strangulation.
Dr. Pirwani's routine post-mortem examination had uncovered a homicide. After reviewing the autopsy results, Detective Mike Garvin wanted to speak with Janice's boyfriend, Domingo Turo. To overcome any confusion caused by the language barrier, he enlisted a translator for the interview.
I was driving.
Turo claimed that recently his relationship with Janice had been rocky. But on the night she died, they had reconciled and were looking forward to starting over. He said he and Janice were returning from dinner shortly after 9 p.m. He started crossing the low-water bridge when a flash flood swept the car into the creek. He struggled to keep the car from being swept downstream. But as the car began to fill with water, he panicked and stated he may have grabbed Janice by the neck to keep her from drowning. But ultimately, the powerful currents tore them apart and she was lost. If Turo had grabbed Janice by the neck, it seemed unlikely that the thin gold chain necklace would have remained intact. Dr. Pirwani's findings, coupled with Turo's statements, led investigators to suspect that he had murdered Janice Walters. But so far, they had no real physical evidence to prove it. Investigators in Fort Worth, Texas, believe that the death of 20-year-old Janice Walters was a deliberate act of murder. And her boyfriend, Domingo Turo, was the prime suspect. But police had little physical evidence and no motive to make their case. Detective Mike Garvin reviewed statements made by Janice's sister, Kelly Hill. Kelly described Janice as a warm young woman, full of fun, who'd always been very close to her family. She was excited at the prospect of being a mother. But Turo, the father of the unborn child, had become abusive and didn't want the responsibilities that came with having a baby. For the sake of her unborn child, Janice had no choice but to end the relationship with Turo. She moved home to be with her family. But Kelly stated that Turo refused to let her out of his life. A few days before Janice died, Turo called the house and they argued bitterly.
I know you are so
Kelly stated she listened to the conversation on another extension. Turo threatened to kill Janice if she left him. Convinced that Turo had followed through on his threat, investigators still needed proof. They pored over Turo's statement, looking for any clue they may have overlooked. They found one. Turo said that he and Janice were returning from dinner when they were caught in the flash flood. Looking over maps of the area, detectives realized the couple had been heading in the wrong direction on a dead-end street. Paul Dixon, Assistant District Attorney for Tarrant County, explains the importance of the discovery.
The neighborhood used that dead-end area as sort of an illegal dumping ground. Old mattresses, old tires, trash, that sort of thing. The police had informed us that from time to time, a body would be recovered from that place.
For investigators, it was now clear that Turo was on his way to the dump to dispose of Janice's body. With his story discredited, detectives now had enough evidence to arrest Domingo Turo for the capital murder of Janice Walters. Police believe that when Janice returned to Turo's home to pick up her belongings, his possessiveness, inflamed by Janice's rejection of him, exploded into violence.
You will stay here. No, you will.
After killing her, he removed her clothes and then tried to hide her body, along with any trace of the crime.
He was traveling across the low water bridge, through the rainstorm, through the flood, and nature intervened and kept him from getting to his goal.
Domingo Turo was tried and convicted for the murder of Janice Walters. He was sentenced to 45 years in prison.
Forensic science was very important because without Dr. Caruana being able to do the autopsy and prove that it was a strangulation, we wouldn't have had a case, even though no matter how much the family thought probably that he had done something foul, we would have had no proof of it at all.
In Texas, forensic science exposed a murderer who tried to submerge evidence of his crime in a flash flood. But in Wisconsin, it took an attentive forensic pathologist to recognize a homicide disguised as an accident. Berlin, Wisconsin, August 22, 1990. A blasting company employee was locking up for the day when he heard someone screaming for help. A man, covered in mud, said he'd just been in a car accident and his ex-wife was unconscious.
Okay, all right.
After calling 911, the two rushed back to the scene. Within minutes, the Green Lake County Sheriff's Department and Berlin Emergency Medical Units arrived. They found a white car in a water-filled ditch, resting against a muddy embankment.
What are you guys doing here? Let's go.
A woman, face down in the ditch, was pulled from the water. Emergency technicians who rushed to her aid discovered that she wasn't breathing. They immediately began began critical life-saving procedures, including CPR, to resuscitate her. The efforts paid off. The victim began breathing on her own. Barely clinging to life, she was rushed to the hospital. As the ambulance pulled away, police took a brief statement from the other accident victim. He identified himself as Daniel Egan, and the woman as his ex-wife, Darlene. He said she'd swerved suddenly to avoid a deer, and the car plunged into the ditch. Egan told deputies he'd gone for help and returned to find Darlene face down in the water. Darlene was taken to the emergency room at Berlin Memorial Hospital, where doctors fought to save her life. A Green Lake County deputy met Darlene's family at the hospital. As he was explaining details of the accident, a doctor came and told them Darlene had not survived her injuries. The family was devastated by the news, and they couldn't understand why Darlene was with her ex-husband. Sheriff's Deputy Ron Click explains.
When I informed them that Dan Egan was a passenger in the vehicle that had gone off the roadway, the family indicated to me that because of the rather stormy relationship that they had, that it wasn't likely that she would allow Dan Egan to be in her vehicle.
The deputy contacted investigators at the scene and passed along the information. Wisconsin State Troopers began their routine accident reconstruction. By measuring the angle and dimensions of the tire marks left on the road, investigators estimated that the car had been traveling at approximately 49 miles per hour, slightly under the speed limit. But the marks left on the pavement were not the result of braking. They were the result of a deliberate, high-speed turn. According to State Trooper Dennis McConnell, that fact was unusual.
An operator in a vehicle faced with a hazard such as a deer, almost 99% of the time, the first driver reaction to that hazard is to step on the brakes. And there was no indication of braking whatsoever.
The findings were enough for investigators to request that a thorough forensic examination be performed on the vehicle. The car was towed to the police impound lot. The hospital pathologist performed an autopsy on Darlene Egan. From the amount of water in her lungs, the official cause of death was ruled a drowning. But something about the victim's condition was troubling. There was an excessive amount of mud found under her eyes and in her nose and ears. The coroner requested that Darlene Egan's body be re-examined by a forensic pathologist. That evening, evidence technicians began processing the vehicle for clues. They noted the condition of the seatbelt. It was stretched over the steering wheel, still in the buckled position. Technicians also observed a lot of mud plastered on the front of the car. That wasn't unusual, but a closer inspection of the bumper revealed the mud. Not knowing its significance, the hair was collected and sent to the lab for further analysis. Examiners would later determine that the hair did not belong to Darlene Egan. Investigators interviewed Dan Egan the following day.
Yeah, sure.
They wanted a moment-by-moment account of the accident. Dan said he and Darlene were going to his mother's house to pick up their 2 children when the accident occurred. Egan told police his ex-wife suddenly yelled, "Deer," and swerved hard to the right off the road. The next thing he remembered was the car in the water-filled ditch. Darlene was unresponsive and slumped against the driver's door. Egan said he climbed out of the car and ran to the blasting company for help. He returned to the scene within a few minutes. He couldn't explain how Darlene ended up face down in the ditch. Maybe she'd come to, struggled out of the car, then lost consciousness again. For Wisconsin Division of Criminal Investigations agent Rick Lewell, the amount of time necessary for that scenario was at odds with the facts.
We soon realized that there wasn't enough time involved for him to get out of the car, to run and get help, for her to get out of the car, for her to fall in the water and drown before he returned to the scene. So it wasn't passing the smell test. Something stunk here. Something was wrong. We had to take a lot deeper look at this entire accident.
For investigators, the circumstances surrounding Darlene Egan's tragic death were raising too many questions. They hoped the forensic pathologist would give them answers. Police in Wisconsin investigating the drowning death of Darlene Egan, killed after the car she and her ex-husband Dan were driving crashed into a ditch, suspected foul play. And Dan Egan's statements to police weren't adding up. To find answers, detectives enlisted a forensic pathologist to conduct a second autopsy. Dr. Robert Huntington III, forensic pathologist for the state of Wisconsin, was given the assignment.
When we do a forensic autopsy, we've got 3 ends in view. We want to see if we can determine a cause of death. We want to see if we can rule out other causes of death, and we want to see if that body itself can tell us anything about how that death arrived to that body.
The pathologist agreed with the original cause of death, listed as drowning. But the injuries noted during the examination appeared inconsistent with injuries caused by a car crash. They looked like something else.
When we get bodies out of a motor vehicle crash, they are definitely banged up.
What is that?
And she
It's not
wasn't
food.
that banged up.
It's a leaf.
And the really disturbing feature were scratches on and around the face. Now, yes, you can get scratches in a car crash, but some of these had a semblance to fingernail, enough to worry you.
The presence of fingernail scratches found on the victim's head suggested the car crash hadn't caused the drowning. In the final analysis, Dr. Huntington believed that Darlene Egan.
Now, suppose somebody was holding her head under the water. Now, that might explain fingernail marks and such like that.
Dr. Huntington's analysis gave investigators insight into how Darlene Egan died. But to make a murder case against her ex-husband, they now needed to find a motive. They turned to the victim's family for answers. Her sister, Denise Krause, told police that Darlene divorced Dan Egan in 1988 after 5 years of marriage. Dan had become physically abusive, and Darlene lived in constant fear of him. But she was putting her life back together. Darlene had recently taken a job as a state police dispatcher and was a devoted mother to her 2 daughters. She had also become engaged to a police officer. Denise added that Darlene and Dan had been involved in a vicious custody battle up until the day before Darlene's death. As the elements of the law began falling into place, police contacted Darlene's attorney in the custody dispute. She told investigators that Darlene had been granted primary custody of the children. And she confirmed that the ruling came down the day before the accident.
I want to take this opportunity to let you know that
In fact, she had met with the couple to discuss the arrangements.
my recommendation is immediate and full custody.
When told of the court's ruling, Dan became irate. He also resented having to pay child support. He vowed to keep his children, no matter what. Armed with this information, investigators went back to question Dan Egan. But this time, as the prime suspect in his ex-wife's murder. Knowing Darlene took great pains to avoid being alone with Dan Egan, investigators wanted to know how the two ended up in Darlene's car together. Dan stated that on the day of the accident, Darlene came by his home to pick up the kids. But Dan's mother had taken the kids that day and was unable to bring them back to his house. And Dan didn't have a car to go get them himself. He admitted that Darlene was upset when she arrived and learned she'd have to pick the children up at his mother's. Darlene and Dan's mother didn't get along, so according to Dan, she asked him to go with her. He claimed that's where they were going when the accident occurred. Before they left, Egan agreed to provide investigators with a hair sample. The hair was sent to the Wisconsin State Crime Lab for analysis. Dan Egan's hair was compared to the hair found on the bumper of Darlene's car. They matched. For investigators, there seemed to be only one explanation for how his hair ended up on the bumper. And that explanation was consistent with the excessive amount of mud noted on the victim's face during autopsy.
Darlene may have pulled out from the can be pushed under the water, and if she did have a handful of his hair, and she's pushed out of the car, she would then grab the undercarriage of the car and try and free herself and ultimately water. And in doing so, she would have transferred his head hair to the undercarriage of that car.
As Darlene struggled to save her own life, she left behind proof of murder. Investigators finally had enough evidence to arrest Dan Egan for the murder of his ex-wife. Based on the evidence, police believe that as the couple drove down the road, Dan wrenched the wheel to the right, sending the car into the ditch. Darlene still buckled into the driver's seat and ripped from the car. In the struggle, Darlene grabbed Dan by the hair. He finally overpowered her, forcibly holding her head underwater until she drowned. For the first-degree murder of his ex-wife, Dan Egan was sentenced to life in prison. Once, killers could escape detection by washing away evidence of their crime. But today, advances in forensic science can bring proof of murder to the surface, even when the victims are dead in the water. Fire turns a couple's home into a death chamber. Investigators believe it's arson, but they need an expert to sniff out the truth. After a student in Illinois disappears, police fear that she's the victim of a murder. is still hot on the trail. Detectives in Tennessee suspect that a missing persons case has turned into a homicide. To make their case, they must rely on canine detectives to dig up the truth. When plotting a murder, a clever killer will do anything to cover his tracks. But not all clues can be concealed. When investigators lose sight of their prey, it falls upon a special breed of dog to pick up the scent of the killer. On June 8, 1994, around 3:15 a.m., a pizza delivery man in the rural community of Belleville, Texas, was on his way home after working the late shift. He spotted a man pulling out of the driveway of a burning house. The driver flagged down the delivery man. He identified himself as Charles Fitz. Fitz said his wife was trapped inside their burning home. He begged the delivery driver to call 911. By the time the fire department arrived, intense flames and heat consumed the home. As long as the fire burned out of control, firefighters could only battle the blaze from the outside. Inside, chances for Francis Fitz's survival vanished with the rest of the couple's home. Emergency medical technicians arrived to treat Charles Fitz. Disoriented and upset, he blamed the fire on the cheap wiring that ran through their home. With difficulty breathing, Fitz was transported to the hospital for treatment of smoke inhalation. By the time the flames were extinguished, some 3 hours later, the house was reduced to a smoldering pile of rubble. Somewhere inside was the body of Francis Fitz. Detectives began their routine investigation into the cause and origin of the deadly fire. They started with a visit to Charles Fitz, who was recovering in the hospital. Fitz told them that he'd fallen asleep that night on the sofa. In the early morning hours, he woke up to a house filled with smoke. He tried to get to the bedroom to save Frances, his wife of 17 years. But the smoke and flames were too intense. He tried repeatedly to get back into the house, breaking several windows in the process. But all of his efforts failed. It was a harrowing account. But for investigators at the Austin County Sheriff's Department, the story was at with Fitz's physical condition. Sheriff's Deputy Richard Coleman explains.
Eric?
From what he was telling us, there should have been, some burn marks on his arm, his face, and it should have singed hair. But with which he had none.
Oh, I'm seeing things.
The next morning, investigators proceeded to the fire scene. Francis Fitz was found in what used to be the couple's bedroom. Her charred remains were transported to the morgue. The medical examiner would later confirm that the cause of death was smoke inhalation. The investigators began processing the burned-out wreckage. Looking to confirm Fitz's story, they searched for signs of faulty wiring. But there was no evidence of an electrical source to the fire. Neither the gas main nor the water heater had malfunctioned. With the obvious accidental causes ruled out, there remained one possibility. The fire had been intentionally set. Investigators began looking for signs of arson. During their search, investigators found debris with alligator-like patterns on the surface. Wood rarely burns this way unless it is doused with an accelerant, like gasoline or lighter fluid. Finding traces of the fluid would be the first step in proving arson. It appeared, however, that the fire had burned away that evidence. But investigators had another tool in their arsenal. Canines can be trained to sniff out traces of arson that otherwise go undetected by humans. George Cabot of the Houston Police Department teaches dogs to search for flammable liquids, hydrocarbons.
It can be naphtha, alcohol, distilled liquor, brake fluid, anything of that nature. Coleman fuel, charcoal lighter fluid, just a large list of things that puts off the same scent that the dogs can detect. Good girl, we got that. Good girl. Let's check.
The dogs began searching through the remains of Fitz's house.
Back here, fetch it up for me.
Hours of searching passed with no signs of a hit. But then they found something. And the location was just inches from where Francis Fitz's body was discovered.
And he worked all areas of the bedroom and came back right to the flooring that the victim was laying on top of, and gave me an alert from right beside of it, and on the bed springs, and that whole section.
With their suspicions raised, investigators next took the dogs to the police impound lot, where Charles Fitz's truck had been found. The dogs were given a command to search for traces of accelerant. Again, the dogs alerted police to the presence of hydrocarbons on the gas and oil wells. They were collected along with the other samples and sent to the lab for analysis. With the help of a canine detective, investigators had recovered enough evidence for forensic examiners to conduct a thorough analysis. At the lab, a piece of charcoal is inserted into each paint can containing the evidence removed from the scene. Then, the can is heated to just below the boiling point for up to 18 hours. During that time, the charcoal absorbs any hydrocarbon vapor. Any potential hydrocarbon is then removed from the charcoal with the solvent carbon disulfide. The resulting liquid is then analyzed by means of a gas chromatograph. By breaking down the substance into its various components, the gas chromatograph produces a pattern of peaks and valleys. In this case, the known pattern of gasoline came up in 3 of the 13 samples. The 2 from the interior of Charles Fitz's truck, and 1 from the bedroom where the body was found. Thanks to the accelerant-sniffing dogs, the deadly blaze had been exposed as a deliberate act of arson and a homicide. And Charles Fitz, the only other person in the house, was the most likely suspect in his wife's death. Police in Belleville, Texas, investigating the death of Francis Fitz, killed in a house fire, believe they had uncovered a murder. Since he was the only other person in the house, Frances's husband Charles was the prime suspect. Travis Kane, the district attorney of Austin County, began delving into Charles Fitz's background.
The family of Francis Fitz told us that Charles Fitz was a braggart, person who really never held a job. He was somebody who wore flashy jewelry, somebody who wore big hats and big boots, who bragged a lot and made a lot of noise about what he was going to do, but never really did anything.
Through family members, police learned that Frances, a secretary, was the breadwinner of the family, even though she struggled with debilitating arthritis.
I thought I just put some spaghetti.
She was dedicated to taking care of Charles and never spoke poorly of him. Though Charles rarely gave anything of himself in return, the marriage seemed solid to outside observers. Having found no obvious marital problems, police struggled to find a motive for the deadly fire. Perhaps in one of Charles's many unsuccessful business ventures, he had made enemies. Someone seeking revenge against him could have set the fire. Detectives decided to take a closer look at some of his former associates. As investigators continued looking for answers, Frances's relatives sifted through the wreckage, looking for any mementos of their lost loved one. During their search, they found some documents that had survived the fire. Among the papers found was a list of overseas phone numbers and several insurance policies on Frances, listing Charles as the beneficiary. Investigators immediately contacted the insurance agent. They learned that Charles Fitz had recently made changes to the policies. In the months before the fire, he had upped the amount of the insurance on Frances's life and on the home. The agent told investigators that Charles Fitz stood to gain $824,000 from the deadly fire. Though the timing of the policy changes was suspicious, it wasn't proof of murder. And investigators still had to rule out the possibility that someone other than Charles Fitz had committed the crime. But all of Charles's past business associates had been dismissed as potential suspects. Now, investigators had to determine why Charles Fitz would want his dedicated and supportive wife dead. For answers, they turned to the only other piece of evidence that survived the fire. One of the overseas phone numbers led investigators to a young Englishwoman named Tracy Munz, who was living in the Philippines. Tracy reluctantly told investigators that she had had an affair with Charles Fitz while she attended college in Texas. She claimed that they planned to marry after she graduated. Charles had agreed to leave his wife. But Tracy grew frustrated when Charles didn't keep up his end of the bargain. She moved to the Philippines and tried to cut ties. Charles wouldn't let it go.
Then in June of '94, he called her and said, "My wife is gone. I'm free to come down to you." And she said, "No, I don't want to have anything to do with you." And that was the last time she spoke to Charles Fitz.
By killing his wife, investigators believed that Charles Fitz was clearing the way to be with his mistress. The insurance payoff would give him enough money to start a new life overseas. Though Tracy Munz had provided investigators with a possible motive, they needed to find proof that Fitz had planned his wife's murder. Poring over the suspect's financial records, investigators learned that Charles Fitz had sold his second car, a Mercedes, shortly after the fire. Though it didn't seem like much of a clue, they tracked down the classified ad and the man who bought the car. To investigators, the language of the ad was telling. It read, 1983 Mercedes, must sell, leaving country. The man who bought the car said that during the sale, Fitz told him that he was unmarried. The ad and the information from the car buyer, in addition to the arson uncovered by the accelerant-sniffing dogs, was enough for investigators to arrest Charles Fitz for murder. Detectives theorized that Charles Fitz believed he had everything to gain from torching his house and killing his wife. Not only would it give him a huge amount of money, it would clear the way for him to be with his young lover. But he would be disappointed. 1 week after the fire, Fitz proposed to Tracy, only to find that she'd already married someone else. On February 2nd, 1996, Charles Fitz was found guilty of capital murder. He was sentenced to life in prison. By picking up the scent of arson, dogs in Texas brought a killer to justice. But in the Midwest, police couldn't prove a murder had been committed until they got some help finding the victim. On March 5th, 1987, a distraught father contacted the Champaign, Illinois Police Department. Ludwig Warner believed his 22-year-old daughter Karen was missing. It was a Thursday, and he hadn't seen her or her car since Monday morning. Her purse, wallet, and eyeglasses were also gone. His daughter frequently sent him her friend's homes, but she never been gone for this long without checking in. The next day, detectives questioned Karen Warner's friends. Like the young woman's father, none of them had seen her in 4 days. One close friend told investigators that over the last week she hadn't noticed anything unusual about Karen's behavior. Though Karen had recently lost her job, she was looking forward to resuming her college career in the fall. Karen hadn't mentioned any plans to travel, but that didn't mean that she hadn't taken an unexpected trip. In fact, Karen had recently been getting calls from an ex-boyfriend named Curly B. Lee. He wanted to rekindle the romance, but Karen was planning to tell him in person that she wasn't interested. Curly had become too possessive and physically abusive. But it was possible that Karen had a change of heart. During their time as a couple, Karen and Curly frequently took unplanned vacations. Investigators at the Champaign Police Department believed there was a reasonable explanation for Karen's disappearance. Sergeant Jim Luking explains.
She was gone, he was gone, and her car was gone. It could very well have been that they decided to go off together, which wouldn't be all that unusual for two people to decide to do that.
To find out, investigators paid a visit to Curly Lee. When they were led into his rooming house, they found that Curly and his clothes were gone. And nothing seemed out of the ordinary. But Karen's family didn't buy it. Desperate for answers, they urged the media to get involved. Hoping to generate a lead, pictures of Karen, her car, and of Curly were published in the area newspapers, along with details of her disappearance. No one responded about Karen, but someone had seen Curly. The caller reported that a friend of hers had driven Curly to the bus station 2 days after Karen's disappearance. Curly said he was heading south to his mother's house in Hughes, Arkansas. Champaign police contacted law enforcement in Arkansas and asked them to speak with Curly. Like the rest of Karen's friends, Curly said that he had no idea where his ex-girlfriend could be. He said they had spoken briefly before we left Champaign, but that was just to say goodbye. As investigators struggled to find answers, the family's publicity campaign paid off. A man in Danville, Illinois, 30 miles from Champaign, recognized the photograph of Karen's car. He believed that same car was sitting abandoned in his church parking lot. A check of the license plates confirmed that it was the vehicle registered to the missing woman. If any questions remained about Karen Warner's fate, the discovery of her abandoned car erased them.
That was the first physical evidence that there was something wrong. It would be unusual for her to be there, for her car to be there, especially.
Investigators brought the car to the police station for a more detailed forensic examination. But the initial search of the vehicle indicated no obvious signs of a struggle. The car was thoroughly dusted for prints. Technicians collected blue and red fibers found on the floor mats and in the trunk. The items were forwarded to the crime lab for further analysis. Hoping someone had seen how the car ended up in Danville, police turned again to the public for help. And again, the strategy paid off. A woman called police to tell them that she may have seen the car. Police brought her in to identify the vehicle. The woman's name was Rhonda, and like Karen, she too was an ex-girlfriend of Curly Lee's. She recognized the car immediately. Police questioned her further. Rhonda admitted that she had driven the car around the time Karen had been reported missing. But she had no idea that the car belonged to Karen Warner. She told investigators that Curly had called her one night asking for a favor. He needed to return a car to a friend in Danville and asked her to drive him because he didn't have a license. To Detective Mike Smith, Curly's demeanor sounded suspicious.
She asked him whose car it was, and he never replied. He never answered. And he told her to avoid certain streets and to drive fast.
Rhonda said that Curly then dropped her off at a bar in Danville. She remembered that he had a grocery bag with him in the car, but she never saw what it contained. Curly explained that he had a few errands to run and told her to wait for him in the bar. He gave Rhonda some money for a drink, then drove away. About 15 minutes later, Curly returned to the bar on foot.
He said that he didn't have a valid...
Later that night, he had some friends drive them back to Champaign. Rhonda hadn't heard from Curly since. Investigators suspected that in the 15 minutes that Curly had left Rhonda alone, he would have had time to dispose of Karen's body, which was likely hidden in the trunk. They believed he then abandoned the car in the church parking lot, located just a few blocks away, and then returned to the bar on foot. They now focused their attention to finding Karen Warner's body, and they believed it was in the wooded area behind the bar.
He was only gone long enough that he couldn't have gone very far to place the body anywhere else, so it had to be down there. In our opinion, it had to be down there in the weeds or in the brush or in the river.
But finding a body in this densely wooded area would be difficult. There were no obvious grave sites. And in the cold air, any smell of decomposition might have been hampered. After 2 days of searching, the team had reached their limits. But investigators had one more option. They called upon the expertise of Joyce Fairs, a dog handler from nearby Urbana, Illinois. For over 15 years, Fairs and her dogs have volunteered their services to local police and sheriff's departments. Bloodhounds like hers are bred to distinguish the vaguest of scents. The handler has to begin with a scent article. It can be any object the victim has come in contact with. In this case, investigators got a t-shirt and a pillowcase from Karen Warner's bedroom and sealed them in a plastic bag to preserve the scent. Fairs then gave the dog the find command, letting him know his job is to find the source of that same smell. The bloodhound took Fairs on a twisted route. 3 times he brought her down close to the river, as if someone had carried Karen's body, looking for a place to hide her, then deciding against it. Then the dog led Fairs to a deep ravine. But it would have been difficult for anyone to cross this gorge carrying a body. Investigators knew that the body had to be near. Within 15 minutes, the dog closed in on an area of brush. At first, Joyce thought he'd lost the scent, but then, in a slight depression covered with brush, she caught a glimpse of a red sweater and a human hand. Investigators in Champaign, Illinois struggled to solve the disappearance of 22-year-old Karen Warner. Hidden in a remote wooded area, Joyce Fairs and her bloodhound believed they had finally found her.
And then I could see her hand, the back of her right hand. And that's when I shouted for Jim Loking to come. I believe that we found her body.
After removing the body, investigators began scouring the area for clues. Nearby, investigators recovered a blue blanket. 100 yards from where the body was found, they discovered a grocery bag, like the one Rhonda described. Inside, investigators found shoes, eyeglasses, and a purse. All of the items were collected and sent on to the crime lab. Joyce Fairs and her dog had uncovered a homicide, and investigators had little doubt that they had found Karen Warner. Using dental records, the medical examiner confirmed that the remains were those of Karen Warner. And a fracture to one of the bones in her throat told him that the young woman had been strangled to death. The lack of defensive wounds and other injuries suggested that Karen had been caught off guard. Now, investigators had to make a murder case. And Karen's ex-boyfriend, Curly B. Lee, was their prime suspect. They turned to the crime lab for help. Examiners confirmed that blue fibers recovered from the victim's clothes matched the fibers from the blue blanket found near the body. Next, the blue fibers from the crime scene and red fibers taken from Karen's sweater were compared against the blue and red fibers found in the trunk of Karen's car. All of the fibers matched. Examiners had proven that Karen Warner had been wrapped in a blanket and then placed in the trunk of her car. And the last person known to have driven the vehicle was Curly B. Lee. Illinois police now had enough evidence to arrest him for murder. But as they headed south to Arkansas to pick him up, they learned from authorities that Curly had fled again. But this time, police quickly tracked him down. By canvassing bus stations, Arkansas police learned that Curly had just purchased a ticket to Palm Beach, Florida. Investigators contacted law enforcement in Palm Beach. They staked out the bus station, waiting for the unsuspecting fugitive to arrive. Curly was arrested and extradited to Illinois. Back in Champaign, investigators confronted Curly with the case they built against him. He admitted killing Karen, but claimed it was an accident. All of the evidence suggested otherwise. Police theorized that Curly had tried to rekindle his romance with Karen. But when Karen refused his advances, he erupted into a rage.
He didn't like to lose anything, and he decided that he was going to teach her a lesson. Now, whether he intended to kill her or accidentally kill her, I don't know, but I think if you strangle somebody, you intend to kill them.
After killing her, Curly struggled to come up with a plan to cover up his crime. He collected Karen's belongings in a grocery bag and then searched for a blanket to wrap the body in before carrying her out to the trunk. Later that night, after dropping Rhonda off at the bar, he drove behind the property and searched for a place to get rid of his victim. In an effort to make it appear that Karen had simply taken off, he drove her car to a nearby church and abandoned it. 2 days later, he packed up his belongings and fled to Arkansas. But with Joyce Fairs and her bloodhound on his trail, Curly's run quickly came to an end. Curly B. Lee was convicted of murder and concealment of a homicide. He was sentenced to 35 years in prison. In the Karen Warner case, the dog had to follow a trail that was 7 days old. To solve a murder in Tennessee, another canine will have to track a scent buried for almost a year.